The sun pounds out a steady drum. What lives in what I become. Every beat outlasts their reign. Every step through blood and stain. Ancient memories choke and burn. Lessons lost, never learned. Still sings beneath my breath. It walks beside me into death. Ash and tears have turned to clay. I shake the end from what I made. All I was built to fall. All I am outlives it all. I was forged when mercy failed and fires were pagan, gods grew pale. This face was never truly mine. It formed itself in death and time. I gave them fire, I gave them love. I taught them wonder, fear and awe. They gave me silence in return and left me yet another blood. The throne still bears my name, not as ruler, the end and blame. Stone remembers what I am, the first to fall, the final man who stands. All I was built to fall. All I am outlives it all. Embers burn to mock the lie. They warm the dead but not the sky. Every breath defies release. Every moment robs my peace. The dead I made do not accuse nor speak. They kneel and bow before my feet. I wear the crown no hand can claim. Forged from loss, it fuels my shame. No dawn remains, no voices cry. No gods remain to question why. All things and all things must die, but I am here. I still survive.